Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EMEA Search webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Teo Patrouceanu, working at Google as a partner manager with publishers from Central Eastern Europe, helping them to monetize with Google solutions. And today we have the pleasure to discuss for 1 hour a very dear topic to us, search. And we have as a guest speaker our amazing John Mueller. Hi, John.
Hi.
Yes, and he's a webmaster trends analyst. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation. To tell you a little bit about him, John coordinates the Google search relations efforts as a search advocate. He and his team connect the Google internal world of search engineering to those who create and optimize public websites. Together, they help to bring an understanding of the external web ecosystem to internal teams and help publishers like you make amazing websites that work well both for users and search engines. Also, John joined Google almost 14 years ago, so thank you for all the hard work. And he's also based in Zurich, Switzerland. But before I hand it over to him, let me share with you some housekeeping rules and also the structure of today's webinar. So first of all, we are all working from the comfort of our homes right now, so we might experience some internet connection issues. If that happens, apologies in advance. We have some backups. Let's hope that won't be the case. And we'll accept live questions. So please feel free to comment in the Q&A section on the bottom of the video. We'll also answer the questions that were submitted in advance. And of course, we encourage you to submit your feedback. You'll see that there is a survey on the right-hand side of the video. So about the structure of today, what are we going to do? So the objective of this webinar is to bring more clarity when it comes to search and to dedicate a generous amount of time to answer your questions. So we'll have the following structure. John will guide us through the honest results policy, search updates, crawling and indexing, Core Web Vitals, page experience, discover, and how you can get help on search. This should take around 30 minutes, after which we'll focus completely on your questions. And for the pre-submitted ones, we're going to allocate 15 minutes. And here I would like to say a huge thanks to all of you who took the time to write them down, pass it to us. And after that, we'll take another 15 minutes for live questions. So this being said, thank you so much. And John, I hand it over to you.
Ooh, fantastic. So cool. It's great to be here, or at least at home and talking to you virtually. It would always be nice to do something in person as well, but we have to make do with what we have. Thanks for the introduction, Theo. That means I can skip my first slide so we can jump on right into the content. So I have a few slides kind of about search in general, and then, like Theo mentioned, we have some Q&A, which is lined up. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of the questions. So if there's something on your mind that you need to have answered, I also have lots of links to other ways that you can get help. So we can look at that. So before we dive in too much, one of the aspects that is really critical for us, especially when it comes to kind of working together with the publisher team at Google, is the honest results policy. And the honest results policy basically says that we should separate search out as much as possible from all of the other parts of Google, especially the parts that are around clients and partners and ads and kind of paid relationships. And essentially what happens is on the search side, when we get questions or escalations internally from that part of Google, we almost always push back. And we have to say, we can't help you. And instead, you should send your partners, your clients, whoever you're working with, to our public channels. We have a help forum. We have office hours. We have Twitter, all of these things. And you should go there instead. And we do this so that we make sure not to give any preferential treatment to any particular side. And that also includes Google internally. So in particular, we have an SEO team at Google. But if they come to us with SEO questions, we tell them to go to the forums and go to the public channels. We have a bit more about this in a podcast episode that we did a while back. I have the link here. There's also a public page about the honest results policy, but it's not like super insightful in that there's not a lot of information there. So the podcast is probably a good place to go. All of the information in this session is appropriately also public information. So there's nothing in here that is unique to kind of publishers that we would only give out to those that signed up or that know about this event. Um, when it comes to search, we do tons of updates all the time. You probably already know this. If you've been working on SEO for your website, you see that things go up and things go down. And it's not just the handful of core updates that we do every year. There are tons of changes that are launched around search. And some of them are very subtle. You might not even notice them. Some of them are very subtle for most sites, but maybe for your site, it's very visible. And kind of this big mix of kind of constantly improving search, that sometimes makes it a little bit challenging, I guess, on the outside. But it's really important for us to keep improving our services, because otherwise, like, if nobody finds what they're looking for because things change, then that would be bad for you, too. The core updates I mentioned already. Core updates are essentially broader changes to our algorithms that we make a handful of times a year. And these are changes that we tend to call out externally. So we mention them just because we want to make sure that people are not super confused by them. In general, core updates are applied across lots of Google systems around search, which includes Google Discover. And it's something where we try to improve the relevance of our search results. It's not that we're saying like there are technical issues on a site that they need to fix, but rather we want to improve the relevance of our search results. And that sometimes means changing things around the way that we look at ranking. And we have a blog post with lots of information on how we approach this problem and what kind of things you as a site owner might want to watch out for. All right, cool. So that was kind of the initial start. Let's look at some of the technical things along the way. In particular, I pulled out some things around crawling and indexing, where I noticed that people tend to have more questions. And especially on, I imagine, the publisher side, where you're creating a lot of content. Maybe it's even a news website. These are topics that tend to come up when we talk with folks externally. So the first one is everything around crawl budget. Crawl budget is basically, I don't know, a public name that was created at some point for our systems, where the goal of our systems is essentially to make sure that we're not causing any problems on your website. So we want to crawl your website as much as possible and make sure that we can have the newest version of the content from your website. And our crawl budget system essentially takes care that we don't cause problems while we try to do that. So it would be bad if we crawled your website so much that you didn't have any capacity for users as well. So our systems try to figure that out. And we try to manage the side of crawl demand, so how much we want to crawl, and versus the crawl capacity side. And those are the two main elements involved with how much we want to crawl from our website. I have some details here, and there's more in a blog post as well. But in general, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that more crawling does not mean better ranking. So that's often something that folks will kind of assume, in that they'll say, like, well, I want Google to crawl my website more. How do I get to that to happen? And usually you don't need to have Google crawl more, because like more crawling doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be more visible in search. Mobile-first indexing is also one of those topics that keeps coming up. Mobile-first indexing is our switch to using a mobile user agent for crawling the web. And we had planned to finish this in, I think, March, but it's currently still underway. We're still migrating some remaining sites over. And the reason it's taking a little bit longer here is that we really want to make sure that we don't cause any problems for the sites that are not 100% ready just yet. So we're kind of trying to find approaches that work well for the web as it is, and in some situations where we actually reach out to site owners and try to work together with them to figure out what we should be doing slightly differently. Um, then in Search Console, one of the themes that comes up all the time, or often, is the status discovered and not indexed. So this is something where I think in the past, it was just kind of not visible to folks externally, so nobody really worried too much about this. We just don't index all content. But it's something where in Search Console now, when you look, there's this extra status that says, like, it was discovered, not indexed. And often site owners are confused and wonder, should they need to change anything there? And I think the primary part here is Google just doesn't index everything. And it might be completely fine that we know about URLs on your website, but we don't index them. That might be perfectly acceptable. That might be something that's working as intended. I would double check if it's actually a critical URL, if it's actually something that is missing from your website where you expect to see a lot of traffic. And if you don't think it's a critical URL, then I would just ignore it. Like, Google can't index everything on the web. And sometimes that includes some of the pages on your site as well. If you do think it's critical, then you should do everything to kind of make sure that it's easy for Google to pick up and easy for Google to recognize that it's important. So making sure that kind of crawl budget side of things is handled well, making sure that you're providing us with signals that tell us this is actually an important page for you with internal linking, for example, and making sure that your overall site quality is really good. So that's something that I've noticed in the past is affecting a lot of the sites where this issue comes up, in that if we're not convinced that your site is worth indexing completely, then we're just not going to index everything completely. Whereas if we know that this is really something that everyone has been waiting for, then of course our systems are going to go a little bit faster and try to get as much as possible in there. JavaScript sites is also a topic that comes up every now and then. We've gotten a lot better with rendering JavaScript sites. So for the most part, I think we're getting things right. When it comes to news websites, I would kind of differentiate between two aspects here. One is if you have really critical, fast-changing pages, like a home page or category pages, I would recommend using static HTML or server-side rendering for that, just to make sure that Google will be able to pick up all of the changes as quickly as possible. For all of the content side of things that don't change a lot, JavaScript sites is perfectly fine there. Also, if you're using JavaScript or tag managers to embed structured data, that's perfectly fine. We have a ton of documentation and videos on this. So if you're just getting started with this topic, there'll be lots of things to check out. With regards to getting pages indexed quickly, like I mentioned before, the main thing is really making sure that it's easy for us to understand the relative importance within your website with internal linking, but also that it's easy for us to recognize the absolute importance of your website through kind of showing that it's really high quality, unique, and compelling site overall. And the more we recognize that a website is fantastic, the more our systems will be able to kind of spend time to actually try to make sure that everything is working well. You can also use the inspect URL feature in Search Console to submit things, but I really recommend making sure that it just works on its own. Cool. All right. Over to the Core Web Vitals. So Core Web Vitals is something probably most of you have heard about. Core Web Vitals is essentially our approach at speed at the moment, at the usability of websites overall. And it's something which is a bit unique in that, on the one hand, we use it as a ranking factor in search. But on the other hand, various other teams at Google also care much about this, in particular the Chrome team, who wants to make sure that the web is actually really fast and usable. Because if the web is slow and bad, then people will stop using the web, which would be kind of awkward for all of us, right? So in the Core Web Vitals, we use three main metrics at the moment for loading, kind of the speed, interactivity, how fast you can interact, and visual stability, which is more about the usability of a website overall. We plan to update these metrics and what we're tracking from year to year, approximately, to make sure that we're tracking things that actually matter for the web. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as you look at this problem. It's not that you fix this once and it'll be like this forever, because the web continues to evolve. And that might mean the measurements that we need will evolve as well. There are other factors involved with the page experience ranking factor. But for the most part, those are things that we've already used as ranking factors. So it's not super new there. Speed, in general, is something that is sometimes really hard to get right. So if you look at this on a bigger website, don't be completely frustrated if things are hard to figure out and hard to make faster, because speed is really a complicated topic. When it comes to the ranking effects of Core Web Vitals and page experience, it's important that relevance remains kind of the primary factor when it comes to search. But there are lots of things where the relevance of pages is very similar, and that's where all of these speed factors play a bigger role. So in particular, if someone is searching for your business by name, it would be wrong for us to show something else that is kind of a little bit faster compared to your business. And the general way that I look at this is that you can make an empty page really fast, but it's not going to be useful for users. So we really need to make sure that the usefulness, the relevance, is the kind of the primary aspect there. We have two main ways of collecting this kind of speed and usability data. On the one hand, there are lab tests. On the other hand, there's field data. So lab tests is what you can test, which is kind of like you create a lab and you estimate what might happen out there in nature. And field data is essentially you send a bunch of scientists out there to see what actually is happening out on the web. And we use field data when it comes to search, because that is what users actually experience. And our lab tests are essentially just estimations or approximations of what might happen on the web overall. So the field data you would find in Search Console. You would find it in the Chrome User Experience Report. The data takes a while to be updated, so that's something to keep in mind. The lab data that you're looking at would be across a number of different tools, like PageSpeed Insights, Lighthouse, webpagetest.org. Some of these lab tests can't test everything because interactivity is also part of the factors. You can implement scripts on your side to also track this data a little bit faster so that you don't have to wait for those 28 days. My general approach is to make sure to use lab tests for iterative improvements and then just confirm it with field data over time. I have a bunch of the general questions that come up with regards to Core Web Vitals. I thought I would just run through those fairly quickly. Do Google embeds count? Like if I use Google Ads or Analytics, does that matter? Or will Google kind of ignore that? And yes, we do count that as well. Whatever users see is what we want to track. We don't want to create a situation where we say, well, Google things are excluded because they're our friends, but rather users don't know why a page is slow. So we want to kind of capture that moment. With regards to AMP versus responsive, which URL matters? Again, the URL that users see. What if only a few pages are slow? So when it comes to field data, we try to aggregate that data, and we group URLs. And that's essentially what you would be seeing here. So if some pages are slow, probably in the group it'll be kind of in there as well, but maybe it's not critical in that group. On the other hand, if the few pages are slow or the most important pages on your site, then obviously that does matter. Sometimes there's a difference between page speed insights and Search Console, or kind of in general, kind of lab versus field data. And the thing to keep in mind is lab data is always an estimation, and the field data is what people actually see. And sometimes the lab data will say, oh, it looks great, but in the field, it's like really slow. Or maybe the lab tool will say, oh, it's super slow, but in the field, we see, well, actually, it's pretty fast because our users are slightly different than what we expected. All right, so over to Discover. Just some short things here. I don't have a ton of information on Discover to share because it's just, I don't know, it's still such a new thing. And in general, we don't have any specific technical guidelines that you need to focus on when it comes to Discover. So what I've seen in kind of anecdotally from sites that reach out or that come to the office hours is that they tend to see very kind of on and off patterns for Discover traffic. And they see a lot of traffic, and then suddenly it goes away completely when we don't show specific things in Discover. The thing to keep in mind, this traffic is really hard to predict, and it can change very quickly. In general, it's not that there are any technical issues involved with regards to kind of Discover traffic coming and going, because sites overall tend to be technically fairly OK. With Discover, we have separate content policies and guidelines, which I recommend double-checking. They're very important for us. Some recommendations about being timely, using dates, using author information, having high-quality images. The high-quality images is particularly relevant because the images are so prominent in Discover. And we have a help page that has a little bit more information there, too. The bigger image previews by default, AMP pages automatically show these bigger image previews, but you can also do that on normal pages as well. There is a robots meta tag to use there. When you use a responsive image format on your pages, you can also have kind of like that large image in your picture tag, as well as kind of the visible mobile versions as well. So it doesn't affect speed that much either. Tracking Google Discover is a bit trickier than tracking search overall. On the one hand, in Google Analytics and in the different tracking tools externally, probably you don't see it as much because the HTTP referrer for Discover is generic for Google Search, because we see it as kind of a part of this overall search platform. In Search Console, you can see impressions and clicks, but you don't see queries because, of course, in Discover, there are no queries to track. But with the URLs that are shown there, sometimes you can work out what kind of topics are interesting or that kind of work well for your site and for your site's users. And based on that, you can kind of work out which, I don't know, strategic approach you might take with regards to future content. And there's some people externally that use this information from Search Console and pull out titles of the pages and kind of try to understand the entities of the pages that get lots of Discover traffic. I have a link here as well if any of you are interested in looking at that. I think that's super fascinating. I don't know if we would provide something similar in Search Console directly, but you can take this data and do with it what you want. All right, and I think two small things just additionally. On the one hand, there is the Chrome follow functionality, which we announced at Google I/O. This is not available everywhere at the moment, so I think it's even just like in the US and in English. But in general, these kind of things tend to be worked out in the US and in English, and then tend to kind of make their way across the rest of the world as well, or kind of be improved over time first. the follow functionality, I think, is super cool because it lets you kind of follow a website similar to essentially an RSS reader, which would be built into Chrome. And it also uses RSS feeds. And there's some tips that you can do to make it a little bit easier with regards to the feeds, like making sure that you have a good title for your feed. But it feels like something where those of you who are not in the US or kind of have an English language website have a chance of preparing things a little bit better for this functionality. Search Console Insights, super cool thing. I think this makes a lot of sense if you're working at an agency for smaller businesses in particular, because it gives them some insight into what is happening for their website without having to use analytics or Search Console, which can be totally overwhelming for them. So this is something where, especially if you're working with smaller businesses, I would double check this and help to get them set up so that they can follow along the progress as you improve their website over time. All right, so let's check out very briefly like how I would recommend getting help, because like I mentioned, the partnership folks can't help you with SEO questions. Uh, my general approach for getting help on search topics is first to use search. It seems kind of obvious, but sometimes it feels like if you take the question that you sent me and just search for it on Google, you'll get the answer already. So I would definitely try to use search first. It makes it a little bit easier to get answers quickly. For general feedback about specific products or kind of the layout and search results pages, make sure to use the in-product feedback links. There are different teams at Google that process this information. They won't be able to answer your questions, but they can take this into account as they improve the products. Use the help forums. So the help forums are a great way to get advice from a bunch of people. They're not primarily monitored by Google directly, but the experts that are active there have a ton of practice, and they can escalate questions that they can't help with to Googlers as well. So I would really recommend trying to use the help forums as much as possible. It's also almost the #1 place I send people when I can't help them in the office hours is like, go to the help forums and provide all the details there. And finally, if none of this is working for you, I do run office hours where you can join in and ask questions in a live format that looks a little bit like this. So basically, it's a live Google Meet Hangout type thing where you can join in. And people can submit questions ahead of time on YouTube. They can ask questions live as well. And we try to go through as much as possible of the questions that come in. And you don't need to mention your site, so it's not like you're putting yourself out there. But sometimes it does help to be a little bit specific on what exactly you're seeing or where you're running into problems. Resources, bunch of links here. I think the recording for this session will be live, and we'll probably have these links in the description as well. These are essentially the common places where you can get help and find information around Google search. And with that, I think we can go to the pre-submitted questions. And like Theo mentioned, we'll have some live questions as well. Looks like people are submitting lots of questions. Oh my gosh. OK. So we'll see how far we can go and how far we'll make it. Let's see. So starting off, and I'll reframe these questions slightly just to make it a little bit easier to understand what I think the primary kind of topic is, or what to focus on here. What causes fluctuations in the crawl requests and response time report in Search Console? How can we double check that things are OK? So I think #1 is it's important to understand that fluctuations in crawl counts are completely normal. So you can take any website that is stable, and you look at those graphs, and they go up and down all the time. Sometimes Google wants to crawl more. Sometimes Google crawls a little bit less. That's completely fine. Also, the average size is essentially, like that fluctuates depending on the URLs that you have that are currently being crawled. The thing I would watch out for is the average response time. And this is the time that it takes for a request to come back to Google after it's made. And it's not the same as rendering a page. So it's not related to Core Web Vitals, but rather just the time like Google asks for a URL and then gets the response back from the server. And this directly affects the crawl budget, so how much we can crawl for a website. My general recommendation is to keep it as low as possible. Some people want numbers, so I just say like below 500 milliseconds. And the important part here is to avoid big fluctuations, especially fluctuations going up, so that it's like you have a stable upper bound. Because if we see that things go up significantly, if suddenly it takes, I don't know, 2,000 milliseconds to get a URL back on average, then we're going to throttle back with our crawling very quickly. And we'll throttle back up more slowly to be kind of careful. So that's something where you really kind of want to make sure that you're in a reasonably fast zone with regards to your website. If it's a really large website, then I would make sure that your response time is even slower. So that different things to think about there. When integrating a consent manager on a website, what do I need to watch out for? And what does that mean for things like videos or embeds, which need explicit consent? So for the most part, we see rarely issues with regards to the common consent managers, because I think uh, people can test if they work well for Google or not. The thing to focus on or think about is ideally use a JavaScript banner instead of an interstitial, and try to avoid using separate URLs where you're kind of like redirecting and redirecting back, because those kind of redirects can cause problems for Google's crawling and indexing. Googlebot doesn't click on links and doesn't use cookies. So Googlebot is not going to say, I agree, and is not going to put an age into the interstitial if you have an age gate. It's not going to keep that cookie that you give it to Googlebot. It'll just try to reload the same page again the next time it tries to crawl. If the content can't be loaded, we can't index it. So in particular, if you have videos on your pages and you want those videos in video search, if we can't recognize that there are videos on this page, we won't be able to index it. And the other thing to watch out for here, past just the technical details, is Core Web Vitals. Users see these as well. And on web.dev, we have a great article on, I think, banners in general and how to implement them in a clean way. So I'd check that out. What's a better place to put your favorite URL if you want Google to crawl it faster? Like if you directly here or like a little bit lower, but more traffic. So I talked about this a little bit already. More crawling doesn't mean better ranking. It's like if you're focusing on crawling, then probably you're missing the bigger picture. So I would recommend like not trying to position it in a way that Google crawls it better, but positioning it in a way that Google understands that it's actually important. So kind of better focusing on internal linking rather than just thinking about crawling. On a specific day, our Discover traffic dropped from 15,000 to almost 0. How is this possible? And how to identify the cause? Like I mentioned, Discover traffic can change very quickly and very strongly. Often, like what I see anecdotally, it's like it's either there or it's not there. So it's less of a situation like with search, where it's like people search a little bit less, or maybe it's ranking a little bit lower, because in the Discover feed, there's no notion of people searching. Often it's not a technical issue. Usually, I recommend focusing on the Discover content policies and guidelines that we have there, where there are some things that are different when it comes to Discover versus search. So things, I think, around like clickbaity content, for example, those kind of things. And also to focus on the overall site quality rather than just on individual URLs. But these are things that individual sites will have to figure out. Does third-party code loaded into an ad script affect the total score on the Core Web Vitals? Yes. Like I mentioned, anything users can see will be reflected in Core Web Vitals. That includes Google Scripts. So if you're testing, make sure to test the way that users actually see it. And sometimes that means you have to optimize the embedding of the scripts that you're including. Sometimes it means you have to remove them or reduce them or kind of track slightly differently, depending on what you're trying to do. Will we face an SEO penalty if we remove AMP? No, there's no penalty or no notion of a penalty of like removing AMP or not removing AMP. Essentially, AMP is a fantastic way to make really fast and interactive websites. But there are lots of other ways to make fast and interactive websites, too. You don't have to use AMP. If you don't want to use AMP, consider using the large image preview meta tag so that we can make the images a little bit larger in Discover as well. But essentially, if you want to move away from AMP, that's totally up to you. I just think in general, for a lot of websites, especially if you're on a popular CMS like WordPress, it's very easy to make an extremely fast AMP site. And making your normal site just as fast can be really hard. So sometimes AMP is just kind of like the easy way to get fast sites. How to handle crawling budget for really large sites. So I think in particular, when it comes to news websites, that's one area where this comes up. My general recommendation is to focus on the new content rather than the old content, and to use internal linking to highlight new content. So on news sites, that kind of automatically happens in that new articles are linked from the homepage. And since we crawl the homepage most frequently, we find those new articles very quickly. On e-commerce, you can do the same thing. So you can also link to your new products from the homepage or from an important category page. To make sure that things are quickly crawlable, like I mentioned, the crawl rate is something to look into. And you can do that by having really fast servers or using a CDN to make it so that we can crawl individual pages a little bit faster. The other thing is that since we also render these pages to understand if there's any JavaScript that's important there, it's also important to make sure that the embedded URLs that you use are also kind of limited. Because if we spend a lot of time crawling your JavaScript files or your CSS files, if you have 20 CSS files in one URL, then that means we spend a lot of our crawling resources on these files that don't actually have content. Whereas if you can optimize your pages so that all of the JavaScript and the CSS is bundled in one file, then suddenly we just have a handful of URLs that we have to crawl when we render these pages. What's the average number of articles a publisher should publish every day? There is no target number. So that's, yeah, I think that's kind of annoying. Like, I can't give you an answer for this, but there is no number. Some sites have a lot of new contents. Other sites don't have a lot of new content. In general, when it comes to search, I recommend less is more as a strategy, in that if you have less content, then quite often you can make that content that you do provide of much higher quality. And having higher quality content overall is something that our algorithms take into account when we try to crawl and index content on a website. And of course, it also plays a role when it comes to ranking. So sometimes, kind of like going from the situation where you're creating, I don't know, 20 or 100 articles a day to going back to creating maybe 2 articles a day can actually give you more traffic, because those 2 articles are really good versus just like this mass of other things that you're creating. And this is something I often see from publishers, where they'll come to me and it's like saying, well, I create hundreds of articles every day, and Google is only indexing 5 of them. It's like, how can I make Google index all of my articles? And usually the right answer there is to stop creating hundreds of articles a day and just like focus on some few things and make them really good. Is there a difference between crawling of news sites versus kind of like regular websites? So from from a kind of purely crawling and indexing search point of view, we don't differentiate between different types of websites. If it's a news website or a company homepage or a blog, uh, we don't differentiate and say like, oh, it's a blog. We should crawl it slightly differently. With news, it's slightly different, specifically when it comes to Google News, because we do have some systems for Google News specifically that are a little bit different, like news sitemaps, for example. But in general, we try to crawl a website the way that we crawl every other website. And it helps us more to fine-tune our systems so that they work for the mass of the web rather than individual types of web pages. So like I mentioned, internal linking is really important. Sitemap files, they also help us with crawling, but they don't replace internal linking. And especially for news websites, you often run into a situation where you have older content that is not as relevant anymore. Uh, I would recommend keeping that if you can, maybe moving it to an archive section. Essentially, you're changing the internal linking and placing it a little bit further away from the home page. But that's fine. And that's essentially the way any normal website can be crawled. Doesn't matter if a domain is still crawled desktop first. Or mobile for mobile first indexing. So like I mentioned, we're still not ready with everything when it comes to mobile first indexing. Mobile first indexing is not a ranking factor, so your site will not rank worse if we're still crawling it with a desktop crawler. You can't force mobile first indexing, at least not at the moment. And one of the things that I've noticed when working together with the mobile first indexing team is that on some sites, it doesn't actually matter that much, in the sense that our systems look at it and say, oh, technically there's a difference between the mobile and the desktop page, therefore we shouldn't shift it over. But where a site owner might not actually care. So common example is if you look at an article, and on the bottom you have kind of like related articles, and on desktop you have 10 thumbnails along the bottom, whereas on mobile you just have 2 thumbnails on the bottom. Then our systems look at that and say, oh, 10 images on desktop, 2 images on mobile. Oh, it's not the same. Whereas as a site owner, you would look at that and say, well, I can't put 10 images on mobile. It's like I'm OK with keeping it like this. So that's something where, like, even for desktop crawling your site at the moment, it's not something I would necessarily worry about, unless you really know there are like significant differences between desktop and mobile. We have a new website since March. Our pages are indexing, but we're not ranking as well as we want. So unfortunately, there's no magic potion for SEO. You still have to do everything, essentially like any business that opens up. You can't just open up a business and expect suddenly people jumping in and buying things from your business. But rather, you have to build your business up. And you have to focus on kind of the technical foundation, that you have a strong basis to work on. But you also need to kind of build up the popularity, the knowledge of your website, and promote your work to others. So there's lots of things involved when it comes to SEO. We have an SEO starter guide that you can check out as well. What should I watch out for when changing domains to mitigate the impact on search? So we have tons of documentation on site moves. I would definitely check that out. There's also lots of external documentation for site moves. In general, just changing the domain name is fairly fast and straightforward. That's less of an issue. If you're merging or splitting or restructuring domains, that takes a lot longer. And because it takes a lot longer, I strongly recommend trying to reduce those kind of changes as much as possible. So if you're creating a new website structure, make sure that you're planning for the long term, like more like 5 or 10-year planning rather than 1-month planning. And when you make any broader changes across a website, document and plan and track really carefully. So we made changes across the search documentation, move things around. And we had gigantic spreadsheets with tons of URLs in them. And that's essentially what you should be doing, like tracking everything meticulously and very carefully from the beginning. Because if you start tracking one thing once things go wrong, you will have a lot of trouble understanding what was the situation like before. How important is it to create and embed video content in your posts in 2021? So there's no measure of importance. So I can't give you like how important is 7 or something like that. In general, videos are visible in search. They don't have to be YouTube videos. You can use lots of other platforms or host them yourself. You can use the right structured data to make it so that we can recognize them properly. I always recommend adding textual content to your video landing pages. So if you embed a video on a blog post, for example, don't just put all of your content into the video. Make sure that you also have something textual on the page, because primarily Googlebot will crawl the web pages and look at the text. If you do use videos on your pages, try to use one video per page or one primary video per page rather than multiple videos, because we essentially try to understand the primary video, and that's kind of keep it at that. All right. So made it through to the pre-submitted questions. Theo, how
Yes.
should we handle the live ones?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, John, for all the details and for taking the time to explain everything so clear. I'm sure the publisher watching right now appreciate your effort. So yeah, we just finished covering the content and the pre-submitted questions. We'll take in the following about 15 minutes live questions. As a reminder, please feel free to comment in the Q&A section on the bottom of the video if you have additional questions. I've seen like some people submitted multiple questions, so that's great. We'll have a limited time, so we'll try like in the next 15 max 20 minutes to try to cover the bulk of it, I would say, because a lot of you are curious. And yeah, for us it's very important to address your questions and clarities, and to make sure that this session is highly relevant and useful for all of you watching right now. So yeah, having this in mind, I think we can start with the first question. And as you mentioned, John, crawling questions are very frequent. So I've seen some of them that are dedicated to crawling. So yes, so you can see the first one is from Stefan. Thank you for submitting it. So we're seeing in Google Search Console that we're still being indexed by desktop crawling. But in the crawl stats in Search Console, we have 65% crawls via mobile crawling and 30% via desktop crawling. Is it true that if we're getting indexed by desktop crawling and we're having only 30% crawls with desktop crawler, we're losing a lot of crawl budget, which is not used for indexing?
I don't think you'd be losing any crawl budget. So for for the cases that I've looked at in regards to this, usually it's due to just different systems using kind of either the desktop or the mobile version for crawling. And in the reports in Search Console, we also include things like ad spot requests and other requests that use the same infrastructure as Googlebot. So my guess, like without knowing your site, is that it's just a mix of different systems requesting things from your site. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about that difference there. And with regards to crawl budget in general, we do try to prioritize. So it's not that we'd say, oh, we just have room for 1,000 URLs today. We will just take the first 1,000. But rather, we'll try to take the ones that are most important for your site. And that means sometimes we'll have a mix of kind of new URLs that we pick up for crawling and other old URLs that we try to refresh. But that mix essentially also means we try to make sure that the important things are covered. And if we have time, we'll look at some other things as well.
Okay, that's great, John. So, Stefan, I hope we answered your question, and also the dedicated section of crawling was pretty clear. Yeah, also, I just want to say there were some questions about Google News. In case you have help, you need help on that. Our colleague wrote in the comments, I think, the resources for that as well. We'll include that, and after you'll get the you'll fill in the follow-up form. You'll get all the links and resources that you need, and the link on demand as well. So we can go to the next session. From Harry, can you share tips on how to optimize content for Discover? So I think here John covered pretty much what it was to cover. Unless, John, you have like something else that you'd like to add. No, that's it.
Nothing additional. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so another question from Anne Marie. She says, hi, and what are the most important factors for Google News Carousel? What speeds up being featured in this category? And is it better to update an existing article or to publish it as a new article?
I don't really have much insight into the Google News side of things, so I can't really say much there. In general, with regards to kind of new articles or updated articles, in search in general, I would try to focus on updating content rather than just creating new content, just generally with that mindset of less is more and making really strong pages rather than creating a bulk of pages. But that might be slightly different on the Google News side. I don't know how that's handled there.
Perfect. Yeah. So as a reminder, if you have questions on Google News, please feel free to use the form, and our colleagues from Google News will help you out. They're an amazing team. Okay, so we go to the next question from Torben. Can a high ads bot crawling rate, so up to 2.5 million a day, we need to rate limited, can have a negative impact on SEO crawling? So that's on average 60K a day.
We do use the same infrastructure for these different types of crawls. And because of that, the crawl budget applies across all of the requests that are made for that infrastructure. So if we spend most of our time crawling kind of ads landing pages, then essentially we don't have extra resources available to do kind of the normal search crawling. But like I mentioned, we try to prioritize the crawling. So it's not that like the mass of the requests matters, but rather like, are we actually indexing the important pages of your website? And if we can't recognize which pages are important, then that's more a matter of fixing the internal linking and making it really clear which pages are important. And then it doesn't really matter if there's an absolute number of kind of like adsbot crawl requests in there as well, as long as we can pick up the important pages for search crawling as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We hope this was clear. The next question is from Ilya. So, how important is to use human readable URLs for Google search?
Good question. So it's not important at all. We do have it in our SEO beginner guide as kind of a good practice. But from a search point of view, we use URLs to identify pieces of content. We don't use them to kind of like rank pieces of content. So for users, of course, that's slightly different, because if a URL looks really weird and confusing, then it's hard for them to link to that URL. It's hard for them to share that URL with other people. It's hard for them to also understand what that URL might be. But from a search point of view, it doesn't matter. Also, in the search results, more and more, we're moving towards kind of the breadcrumb model of showing URLs in search. So even in the search results, people don't necessarily see those URLs. But I'd still say, from a user point of view, make sure that they're kind of reasonable. From an SEO point of view, don't worry about it.
Okay, thanks, John, for clarifying this. The next question is from Dan. So what signals does Google use to evaluate original content? And how can we ensure Google ranks the original source? We often see that Google is displaying some news publishers covering a story ranking above the publishers by rewriting the story from an original source.
We use a number of factors to try to understand where a piece of content is coming from and what might be the source of that content. But essentially, our algorithms don't make a judgment call, and they don't say this is the original version. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. The other is that sometimes when people write about an existing story, that new version of that content is equally relevant and useful. And it's not the case that we would say, like, someone is covering the same story again, therefore we should only show the original. You can kind of think of it as like the situation where, like, Shakespeare wrote a bunch of plays, and of course, those are the originals, but there's so many other documents out there that talk about those plays, that quote those plays. And it wouldn't be correct to say, like, if someone is searching for Shakespeare plays, that we only show the originals, because all of these other pieces of content that quote it, that talk about the same topics, that talk about, I don't know, the stories that happen there and give background information, they're equally relevant. Sometimes they're even more relevant than the original. So just because something is original doesn't necessarily mean it will always be ranking first in the search results.
Yes, and I would say, like, plus one to what you mentioned, John, and always remember to contact the Google News team in case, and you can also submit a report to them, and with the query and the URL of the original content, and they might help you out with some next steps if that would be needed as well. Okay, so Davy, your question. So has an internal link more value for crawling if you put these in the intro of a text, or it just doesn't matter?
It doesn't really matter. Yeah,
That was a short
that's the
answer.
easy one. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So, Miguel, your question. So, as a news publisher, may I ask if Google crawl is still important in having a page indexed immediately, or is updating the submitted sitemap enough?
I don't know about Google News in particular, but for search, we do want to have internal linking. So it's something where sitemap file helps us to better understand what is happening on a website, but we need to have the context of internal linking. And from that, like, we need to be able to crawl the pages and recognize, oh, like, this is a link with this anchor text that is leading to this page. And without that context, we lose a lot of information, and it's hard for us to judge which URLs are important. So don't only put things in a sitemap file.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much, John. And I just want to say we have about like 2-3 minutes left. We'll try to put it to like to 5 because we kind of have tons of questions for you. Um, so we'll try to cover as much as possible in the next 5 minutes. And if you'll have extra questions, you can always join John's office hours, and you can discuss more on that. But now, just taking the next 5 minutes. So, for example, we have the question from Olaf. So, if I want to deprioritize internal links like login, sign in for Google Bot, but still want them to be usable for clients without JavaScript, what are my options? Is it still important regarding the crawl budget?
I wouldn't care about this. So it's something where theoretically you can hide these links, but if these are login pages, then we learn fairly well that they're not critical. And you can block them with robots text. You can put a nofollow on the link if you want. But I don't think this changes anything for a website overall. And it's certainly not something that you need to hide from Google.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much, John. And now we have a question about duplicate content. And Anne-Marie would like to know about the impact of cross-domain duplicate content. What is the best practice? Is it a problem if we publish the same content pieces, sometimes 100% duplicate content, or sometimes only the same video but with different context on different domains in their publishing network without the cross-domain canonical? And she thanks you in advance.
So the main thing that I see here is that it makes it harder for us to understand which of your pages we should be showing for queries around that. So you're kind of competing with yourself on the one hand here. And it's something where I would try as much as possible to use the rel canonical across these different domains so that we can understand, it's like, this is the one that you really want to have shown. The one place where I might say it's not so critical is if there's a really strong aspect that's tied to the individual sites. So for example, if this is really important for local news, and you have the same, maybe an event that is taking place in different places in the country, then maybe it makes sense to have that duplicated event across these different locations, because people want to find that combination of this general content plus that local context. But if it's exactly the same thing across like just different domains, then I would try to use the rel canonical and just say, actually, just one version is the primary one. And using the rel canonical also makes it so that you can pick which one Google should be showing, rather than kind of leaving it to Google to see what might happen.
Okay, John, we hope this clarifies the question. And we have now a question from Roland, very interesting one. So they use stock market information, such as stock prices, to automatically generate news via text modules. They try to make rather boring numbers more informative and readable, and the automatically generated news are informative so far, but from he thinks that they might be considered as spam. Is it okay to submit such news via a news sitemap, or does Google generally consider such content as spam?
I think it's super complicated topic, and it's one of those areas that touches on lots of kind of the newer technologies as well. As like, where do we put computer generated content? Is that spam? Is that useful content? And I think in some situations you can make really well readable and useful computer generated content pages. And in other situations, I think there's sometimes kind of the desire to do the minimal amount of work for maximum number of kind of content pages. And that's probably not so good. So in our webmaster guidelines, we explicitly say automatically generated content should not be indexed. So that's kind of the basis assumption. How that might evolve over time from a search point of view, I don't know. I also don't know if on the Google News side, if there are any specific policies around that already. But at least on the general search side for the webmaster policies, technically, that would be considered auto-generated content, and we would not want to see that indexed. I suspect this will change over time as the computer-generated content just becomes of higher and higher quality. But I don't know. It's really hard to predict.
Okay, I see. Thank you, John, for the honesty. And well, since this session seems to be like very valuable for you, and you still have a lot of questions, maybe let's take like 10 more minutes. So try like in the next 10 more minutes to cover more questions, if that's okay with you,
Sure,
John.
sure, sure.
And for the ones of you that we know, like we communicated 1 hour of your time, you can either stay and like continue seeing the live stream, but you can also watch it on demand if you're curious to hear the rest of the questions and the answers. So yeah, I'll continue. So thank you so much for all the questions. It's yeah, unbelievable how many we get. John, you're very popular. Okay, so the next one, it's about a news website, and they want to know how to properly organize pagination of selections with more than 200K or 300K news. More than 10K pagination pages are published. Is it possible to display only the last 30-50 news per section and download the rest of the news by clicking the More News button? And do all the other pagination pages make a 301 redirect to the main page of the section, or use some other solution? Yeah, it's a long question. Sorry, John.
OK. I I suspect it's probably already working well for you. So if it's working, then I would try to keep it. In general, when it comes to content on a website, like I mentioned, internal linking is really important for us. So we need to be able to find some links leading to that content. When it comes to news websites, usually that means at some point these news articles will drop out of the main category page because they're a little bit older, and they tend to move to an archive section. And if you have an archive section, then like we can find a link to the archive section. We can find all of the old content there. So I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about kind of like how you manage pagination on the category pages, but rather have a clean system where it's like we can crawl your website, and when we crawl it, we can find all of your content. And some of the content might move to an archive section over time. Some of it might be on the main category pages. Some of them might be on paginated versions of the category pages. But essentially, we need to be able to find links to all of the pages that you do want to have indexed. So that's kind of the approach I would take there. So less worry about like how many things per section you have, but more is like, how do I make sure that everything is somehow findable?
Okay, thank you, John. So the next question we have from Lukasz. Is it possible to have a good CLS on mobile with sticky video on site?
I don't know. I'm not aware of any particular issues with regards to like the cumulative layout shift and mobile and videos. But it seems like something where maybe it would make sense to have some sample pages and to show it to some people, maybe on the Chrome side, who are working on CLS in particular, to get their input there. So less as it's like, how do I do this for search, but more, how do I do this so that it works well for Core Web Vitals in general?
Okay, okay, thank you so much for this. Yeah, another question that we have, so many questions. So this time from Jorg. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. If not, I apologize. Is it more difficult for Google or more risky for the publisher if the relaunch of a website is also used to clean up the content of this website on a large scale by analyzing low or no performing content in advance and deleting it during the relaunch? Or should such a large scale cleanup take place before or after the relaunch?
So with a relaunch, I imagine you're restructuring the internal linking and the URLs on a website. And in general, what happens with those kind of changes is we have to reprocess the whole website overall anyway. So if you make content changes along the way, if you fold things together, if you remove content that you find not useful, that's a good time as any to do that, because we have to reprocess everything anyway. So might as well reprocess a clean state afterwards. So I wouldn't necessarily split that out into something that you do separately. The other thing I would keep in mind is that just because something gets very few views from search doesn't mean it's bad content. So kind of to uh, think about the quality of your content in a more holistic way, rather than just, oh, it only got 5 clicks, but rather like, is it really bad content, or is it just content that is just rarely used but is very useful in those moments?
Okay, thank you so much, John. Our next question is from Nelly. So, John, what are your recommendations regarding cross-posting of articles from different sites? I think, like with content syndication, they currently refrain from using cross-site canonicals. As our interpretation of developer guidelines isn't that canonicals are only to be used to highly technically created double content intrasite. So instead, we mention and link to the source of the original content if we host articles from other sites. Is that interpretation in line with the best practice recommendations? I know there was a
So
similar question, but
yeah.
it's like
Yeah, so rel canonical across different sites is perfectly fine, and we do use that. So I would recommend using that. I think it's fine to syndicate content if you're reaching a broader audience that way. I wouldn't necessarily syndicate content with the intent of kind of having more pages indexed for search. So using the rel canonical is a good way to help with that. For the most part, probably we can also figure it out with the link when you're linking to the original source. But the rel canonical is a really clean signal that helps us there. And that works across different domains, across different sites, even if it's like on some other site that is not technically a part of your site network.
OK, that's great. So we have another question focusing on Core Web Vitals and page speed. So there are news publishers, and they optimize their Core Web Vitals scores and page speed, and they struggle to see their articles ranked in Google News and Discover. So what common metrics they should need to focus on for a better ranking?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, we do use Core Web Vitals and Page Experience for ranking, but it's not like the primary factor. So it's not the case that you can just make your pages faster and they will rank better. So we do focus on relevance quite a bit for that. I imagine in Google News and Discover that's just as important on those sites as well. It's sometimes the case that we get kind of questions on Twitter or elsewhere where they say, oh, my site is like 1 second faster than my competitor. Why are they ranking above me? And usually that's just because there's so many other factors that come into play in search. And speed is just one of those things. And like I mentioned, a good mental model is if an empty page is really fast, but it's not very useful. And essentially, we need to make sure that the search results remain useful for users.
Yeah, exactly. We always have the user in mind.
Yeah.
Yes. So the next question is site authority a stronger ranking signal for top stories as compared to original content? Because we have observed sometimes that although small publishers break the news, but after ranking for some time, other authority sites appear before smaller ones.
I I mean, we don't have a notion of anything like domain authority or anything like that. There's some third-party metrics around that, which I think are interesting to look at, but we don't use them for search. So that's always kind of tricky, but it's kind of in line with the previous question, where like sometimes there is an original person who brings something out, but that doesn't mean that that page is going to be the one that is always shown in the search results. And we see that firsthand with almost all of our blog posts that we do from the search side, in that we will create the blog post, and then someone like Search Engine Roundtable, Barry Schwartz, will take those blog posts, or Search Engine Land, and they'll write an article about those blog posts. And essentially, they will rank instead of our content. And in the beginning, you could look at that and say, oh, this is frustrating. It's like, I was the original one who put this together.
Yeah.
But for users, it's actually kind of useful, because suddenly there's a little bit more background information, or at least there's kind of this notion of trustworthiness in that, well, if this legitimate source is also writing about this topic, maybe it is actually the case. So it's something where I understand that it's frustrating to kind of like break the news, and then you're visible for a short time, and then someone else also notices that it happens and writes a lot of the similar things as you wrote, and then suddenly they rank. But to some extent, I think that it's expected. There are definitely cases where if someone is like just copying one-to-one your whole content, then we should be doing a better job of recognizing that and handling that differently. But that's also something where maybe the DMCA process would be the appropriate channel to take there to look at. And when it comes to news, like Theo mentioned, sometimes the news contacts can also help with that.
Yes, totally. Please feel free to reach out to our colleagues from Google News support. OK, so we have just a little bit of time left. I suggest we take the next 3 questions, and then we can wrap it up. It looks like we'll have to do another session at
More and
some point.
more.
More and more, exactly. So this question comes from Ivan. It's about Search Console and analytics. How can we connect one website in Search Console with analytics property that contain multiple sites as views with the right analytics view?
I don't know. So I don't have much insight into how
Oh,
the analytic sides handled this. But I would recommend asking in the forum about this, because I'm sure there's some tricks that you can do.
yeah, and I would say also like reach out to our Google Analytics support. Maybe they might have also like more insights on that if the forum won't help. Okay, so the next question coming from Benjamin. Hi John, when you replaced the crawl error report with the index coverage report in 2019, you have shut down the crawl report API without a replacement. Are there any concrete plans to give us a replacement for the crawl error API, or are there any other plans to add features to the Search Console related APIs?
I don't know. So on the one hand, we try not to pre-announce things. So I wouldn't be able to say what we have planned there. But I don't see a replacement for something like the crawl error report in API form, because in general, if we don't show the data in the UI like that, we would not have an API for that. So that's kind of the general approach there. And it feels like something where maybe the server logs would be more useful there. With regards to other things in APIs, we are actively working on different things that we can add to the API or do differently. But sometimes these things just take a lot of time to kind of actually make it live. If you're interested, you could also contact me on Twitter, and I can see if there are any kind of beta plans open at the moment where you can join. I don't know offhand if there's anything like that around the APIs. But if you're kind of like active implementing APIs and you'd really like to add more, then I'm happy to see what we can do there.
Yes, thank you, John. You see, like people are very interested in the future and how they can contribute. So that's nice to hear on one side. Okay, so we'll take the last question of today. So it's from Harry. We use a mobile subdomain m.subdomain.com, like as an example, and also serve content on AMP. What's your view on that combination?
Um, so technically, we support it. I would recommend trying to move away from m.domains as much as possible, just because it's so much trickier when it comes to search. And it makes things like tracking things in Search Console a lot harder. So in particular, with mobile-first indexing, we would try to focus on the m.domain. And then you might see a lot of m.urls in Search Console. And it just makes it a lot harder. So it kind of with just looking at the m.domain variation of that problem, I would try to focus on one responsive version instead of having desktop, mobile, and then AMP. With regards to AMP and kind of a responsive version, I think that's a little bit less of a problem because AMP is really seen as kind of an alternate URL. But there are also people that have switched their whole sites to using the AMP framework and essentially just have the AMP version. So that might also be an option. But I think my main point here would be like move away from the m.domain setup as much as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think with this, we closed our 45 minutes of questions for this session. Exactly, considering the pre-submitted ones and the live ones. So I would just like to say a huge, huge thank you for attending our webinar and for all your questions. So just to conclude, John took his time to guide us through the honest results policy, through search updates, crawling, a lot of questions on that, indexing, core web vitals, page experience, discover, and how you can get help on search. So we think it was very important to discuss also the resources that can guide you through to get all the answers that you need directly and at any time. Personally, I would highly encourage you to attend the office hours with John and his team. Yes, I have. I mean, they're amazing experts and professionals. And with the publishers that I work with and attended his office hours, they always came back with very good feedback for those sessions. And also, yes, you and your team can watch this session anytime on demand. We hope it was useful and you have more clarity when it comes to search. And of course, we're eager to hear your feedback to improve similar sessions. So in case you didn't fill in the survey, we'll follow up with it, the resources mentioned by John, and the link for you to watch it on demand. Thank you so, so much for taking the time to be today with us, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks.